My Mother's Garden. Written and narrated by Lady Spookaria, and featuring Swamp Dweller and Stache. My mother always had a green thumb. Her garden was her pride and joy, a place neither of us left. My rare experiences of the outside world happened when I peeked over the high walls. I didn't want to leave once I saw what was on the other side. The garden was the last green place as far as the eye could see. It was a highlight, an oasis, and she welcomed all. It was a popular spot for photographers. It was that beautiful. And people who wished to take some of the bounty and beauty of nature home with them. It was the only green place in a city riddled with metal and concrete. First the parks had been claimed, then the gardens, and finally, those too had been lost. A twisted corruption of the natural world. The smog of the city meant people needed to wear gas masks to protect themselves. But in the garden, they didn't need to wear them anymore. They could finally breathe. It was a refuge from the concrete urban wasteland the city had become, and one of the few places it was safe for children to play. When I asked her why she allowed people inside, she said it was her bit of paradise she could share with others. Children would come, and since I was homeschooled, I often didn't share in their experiences. They spoke about their families, and I only knew my mother. When I asked her about my father, she showed me a man in a black and white photograph. He was dressed far different from the other men who visited her garden. She told me he had passed away during one of the world wars. She didn't mention him after that. Tending to the garden was her passion, her life's work, and so I found myself drawn to it as well. She said she used to help my grandfather with it, before she became estranged from the rest of the family. My father was someone he didn't approve of, and so she was cast out and forbidden to return. Yet, our neighbors would come. They would ask her what her secret was when it came to growing fruit and vegetables, or about the flowers regularly in bloom. It wasn't uncommon for me to see her in the kitchen, a happy place. There were terracotta pots filled with herbs, with wooden cabinets and the smell of fresh food cooking that would fill my nostrils whenever I'd step inside. She would cook for the homeless or anyone who needed a meal. All they had to do was knock and ask, and she would happily share what we had with them. A majority of the time, her garden was a paradise. Yet, there were times when it would draw people in who were wounded. There was a time when I was playing on the lawn with my dolls. My mother loved the fact I had a childhood because she never had one. While I sat playing, a man entered through the metal gates. Instantly the mood of the garden changed, and I didn't know why. His clothing was disheveled, his hands trembled, and he brought a rope with him. His eyes darted around, paranoid and frightened. I dropped my doll and ran inside the house, pointing outside at the bad man. I didn't understand at the time. I cried and told her that he had entered the garden. Yet, she already saw him through the large kitchen window and prepared some tea on a tray. A teapot with 2 teacups coupled with saucers. I yelled at her, "What would tea do?" She smiled, her serene face unworried, and stroked my hair before she kissed my forehead. My mother took the tray and walked out into the garden towards him. The cups jingled against the saucers, her head up and hair loose. Her walk was slow, graceful, and steady. I climbed up onto the kitchen cabinet, looked out at her and watched. The man had tied the rope into a noose, half pleading and yelling at her to leave him. Let him die in the only place he found peace. I couldn't hear what she said to him. She gestured with her hand for him to come and take a seat on the stone bench. Her lips moved, and I couldn't hear what she said again. He hesitated, hands trembling and his fists remained tightly clenched. Patiently, he waited, and to my surprise, he complied. He sat beside her with the noose falling to the ground. His face rested in his hands. His body rocked violently and he let out a choked sob that turned into a wail that I could hear. That everyone could hear. She placed a hand on his shoulder and offered him some tea. He accepted it. I still don't know what she said to him. And after a while, he began to relax and together they spoke. Finally, she sent him on his way and refused to let him take the noose. When my mother came back inside with the empty teapot and cups, I asked her what happened and who he was. She told me he was a stranger in need. I was confused. I asked if she was angry he was threatening her in her garden and had behaved like this. She smiled softly, patiently, and rinsed the cups while she listened to me. She answered, I could be angry, or I could focus on someone who needed help. It was not the first time a stranger had come and needed her aid. The next time we were playing on the lawn together. There was a scream from one of the many visitors before they fled. It was a man holding a knife in his hand, a crazed look in his eyes, and my mother's arms moved protectively around me. Calmly, she asked, "Are you in need of help?" He jerked backwards as though she struck him with her fist. He didn't expect this kind of reaction. His hand with the knife twitched. My mother patted my head gently and I knew what that meant. I ran to hide behind a tree. This time, I could hear the conversation as it took place.
Just go. Go. I need to die.
"Would you like some tea?" she offered, no fear in her voice. He raised the knife to her, desperate for her to leave him alone.
I mean it. Get back.
"Would you like some tea?" Again, the same question. He stared at her, dumbstruck at both the invitation and her fearlessness. He shook his head, lifted the knife and held it across his throat.
Please. Just let me die. I want to die somewhere peaceful.
She smiled softly. "And yet, you disturb the peace and tranquility of my garden. I will make a deal with you. If you have a cup of tea and talk with me, that is all I ask of you." He stared at her, completely puzzled, and lowered the knife. "If you still believe it is time to end your life afterwards, then I will accept it is your life to do with what you choose." He was silent. Her hand reached out and he stared at it in confusion. His grip tightened and his body became stiff. Patiently, she curled her fingers, beckoned him to hand the knife over, and he complied with her wishes. She turned and went to fetch the tea while I remained in my hiding spot. The knifeless man stood, limp and staring up at the sky. She returned with the jingling cups once more. The knife was gone, and she offered a cup to him. He accepted it gladly. And he sat beside her on that bench she brought those who were suffering. And then she simply listened to him. The words came out like a flood. Everything in his life had gone wrong. There was no happiness left for him. No joy. The warmth of the tea filled his body, and my mother's soothing words healed his soul. He wept. Before he was ready to leave, again, my mother offered to get the knife for him, and he refused. Every weekend since, I watched him return to that same spot to sit, until old age finally took him. There were countless others who were saved in a similar fashion. And now, I must tell you my tale. There was a man who came with a gun in hand. I sat in the grass eating an apple under the shade of a large tree. The tortured souls no matter scared me as much as they used to. My mother stopped, paused and offered him tea and a talk, the same way she always did.
No, I don't want your damn tea. Just leave me alone. I've had enough.
As always, she persisted, unwilling to give up on someone who needed her help. His eyes changed color, and everything about him changed.
This is where you've been hiding, with your abomination. A curse and our father's shame. It will be purged. No, please, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me.
It was as though someone else was in there with him. To my surprise, he recognized her and they did not like each other. He laughed, shaking his head in disgust, and pointed the gun towards me, calling me an abomination, a curse on humanity, and something that needed to be purged. I didn't know what to say. I was speechless. I stared up at the gun, frozen in fear, and I could hear my heart rate increase. I never saw my mother angry. Not until today. She stepped forward and snapped his arm like a twig. He fell to his knees and screamed in pain. Then, strangely, a sword rose up and pierced her chest.
No, please, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me.
He was stunned, shaken, and screamed he didn't mean to do it. He didn't want to do it. That something made him do it. He fled her garden covered in my mother's blood, and that was the last I ever saw of him. I hurried over to her, held her in my arms. On her shoulder blades, got darker before the blood seeped out of them. I wept and held her. Her life faded away. The police came and interviewed me. The sword disappeared and so had the murderer. The city mayor gave me permission to bury her on the property itself. She was buried under her favorite tree, and near the marble bench she would speak with people. Every so often, her spirit would appear and help people the same as she did in life. I missed her. The little house felt lonely without her there. I missed her voice and her presence. Everyone did. Many, many years passed, and soon the people began to forget about her. There was still the memory of the ghost of the garden, the mysterious woman who would speak to people. I was forced to grow up. My long childhood was forever over. Without her around, my body grew at a normal speed and I changed. Soon I had streaks of grey hair, my eyes clouded and fogged over, my back hunched from long hours, and my hands were coarse from long days of work. Often they tremble. It hurts to walk, and the pains of age began to take hold of me. Now, I've taken over her task of maintaining the garden, speaking to the guests, cooking food for the homeless, and serving tea to tortured souls. Now, I must ask, would you like some tea? I hope you enjoyed this story. If you haven't already, please do yourself a favor and check out the amazing Swamp Dweller and Stache. Both of them were graciously kind enough to lend their voices to this story. Their links are available down below. Also, don't forget to stab or caress the like button, comment, share the video around, and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget about that little bell. This video is made with the support of my incredible Patreons, channel members, and top tippers. All support is greatly appreciated. Check out my merch and my social media links down below. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.